Hello and welcome to this edition of the Gunshine State, brought to you by Florida Carry. I'm your host, Craig DeLuz, and this is where we talk about firearms policy, Second Amendment civil rights advocacy right here in the great state of Florida. So please take a moment, like and share the program so that your friends can join in the conversation. Also, if you haven't already done so, please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook, and follow us on Instagram where you can watch this program. And you should get alerts as soon as this program goes live so you can participate in the live chat, at least on YouTube, on Facebook, as soon as the program goes live. So guys, make sure that you do that. Also, please take a moment if you are not already a member of Florida Carry. Just know Florida Carry is not just a Facebook group. It's not just a Instagram profile. It's not just a YouTube channel. This is a Second Amendment civil rights advocacy group that's fighting for your rights right here in the Gunshine State. So please take a moment, follow the link in the description of this video, and become a member. It's real simple. We have membership levels of all different types for all different sorts of financial situations. So please make it a point, become a member of Florida Carry. Now, once again, we're all dealing with the whole COVID-19 and everything that's going on with COVID-19 here in the state of Florida. Obviously, in states all across the country, there are different things that are happening. But one of the things that seems to be common is there's a lot of secondary headlines. Headlines specifically dealing with our right to keep and bear arms. Whether it's prisoners being released or law enforcement saying that they're not going to enforce certain crimes, and people's need, and this is, by the way, leading into people's desire or need to purchase firearms, because people are not recognizing people who either had just procrastinated on their desire to exercise the right to keep and bear arms, or people who are all of a sudden seeing the light on the importance of exercising their fundamental right to keep and bear arms. But we've seen record firearms sales throughout the country. Doesn't matter what state it is, but we've seen it throughout the country. Well, there's only a few people who write on these issues on the regular, only a few publications that actually cover them with people who are knowledgeable on these issues. So with that, I wanted to bring a gentleman who I've known for a number of years now, who writes for the Washington Free Beacon, and he specifically covers firearms issues, I believe, along with other issues, but he specifically covers firearms issues for the Washington Free Beacon on issues all across the country. So with that, I wanted to welcome to the program Mr. Steve Gutowski. Steve, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
All right, now, Steve, you've been writing for the Washington Free Beacon for quite a while. Do me a favor and just let our viewers know who might not be familiar with you, some of the beats and whatnot that you cover for the Washington Free Beacon.
Yeah, mostly I cover firearms policy and politics, especially on the national level.
Cool. All right, so what are some of the major headlines, or at least let's talk about some of the major headlines that you've been writing about and you've been dealing with since the whole COVID-19 crisis or emergency started?
Well, the two biggest ongoing stories throughout this pandemic have been, one, the incredible, unprecedented increase in demand for firearms in the United States. March actually set an all-time record for gun sales in this country, in direct response to concerns about how things are playing out with COVID-19. Probably not necessarily the virus itself, obviously, but from sort of the effects it's had, like police officers becoming sick, police departments saying they're not going to arrest people for certain crimes anymore, prisoner releases, things like that, that have really caused a lot of people to want to go out and buy a gun for self-protection. And then the second storyline that I've been following continually is the fight over whether or not gun stores and gun businesses are essential, and whether or not they can be totally shut down during the emergency response to the virus, and obviously all of the constitutional questions that come along with that.
Okay, so now this is interesting because now I know that you wrote about at least one case in Los Angeles, California, where a judge basically said, yeah, they were okay to shut down. The Los Angeles sheriff was okay to shut down a gun store. But this was in spite of the president and the Department of Homeland Security actually issuing a statement saying gun stores are considered essential businesses. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, so the case you're talking about is actually just north of LA in Ventura County, where the sheriff there shut down the gun stores, and it was sort of a local case filed by some gun rights activists living in that county. And there was just there haven't been obviously a ton of rulings yet because it's only been a week or two since some of these cases got started, since a lot of these shutdowns really got started. And so this was only one of three initial rulings that we have right now. It's the first federal ruling, and all it is it denies a temporary restraining order, which means the judge didn't think that the case was strong enough to block the shutdowns at this moment. Now, I imagine other judges will probably feel differently about this situation, but there was the federal guidance that was changed, but that guidance is non-binding. So essentially, it's just what the Department of Homeland Security thinks the state should do, and so they don't have to listen to it. Although I will say that most of them have, even states or localities where they had previously shut down gun stores, like in New Jersey and actually Los Angeles County's sheriff, after the federal guidance came out, they immediately reversed themselves and allowed gun stores to reopen there, citing that guidance, even though it's technically non-binding.
Now, are there certain states where you're finding these sorts of instances more prevalent than others? And are there some states where you're like, yeah, this isn't even an issue?
Oh, I think it's not an issue in most states at this point. There were only about a dozen states where they hadn't initially declared gun stores to be essential and allow them to stay open in some capacity. Now, obviously, they're still subject to social distancing rules, where things like you can only have 10 people in the store at once. Some states, like New Jersey, are requiring them to operate by appointment only. Unfortunately, when you go to buy a gun from a gun store in the United States, you have to complete your background check in a face-to-face process. There's no online option for that. So, that's why this is really a big question. Gun stores can't really operate on a sort of curbside pickup basis like a restaurant or Best Buy or something like that, because you have to physically fill out the form that's required for a background check by law. And so maybe there'll be some changes to that coming forth from the FBI at some point, but that's why this has become sort of a big issue. And, I think you've seen it, you hear about it more in California because California didn't issue a statewide decision one way or the other. They're essentially leaving it up to the sheriffs there. And so they've all done different things depending on whatever the local sheriffs. I mean, even Los Angeles County Sheriff Villanueva, he has repeatedly flip-flopped. He's closed them and then opened them and then closed them and then opened them and then now he's the county. I guess the county got annoyed with him enough, the county commissioners there, that they removed him as the emergency.
Yeah. I was actually, it's funny you said that because I was actually just about to mention that. But, my experience has been, and I've talked to a number of FFLs, is, those that are open for business are promoting social distancing. I know one retailer basically said, look, we're only allowing 2 customers in the store at a time. Even while you're in the store, you have to do social distancing. And when you're outside waiting, you need to practice social distancing 6 feet. One retailer flat out said, if you're not doing it, I will just shut down the store. That's how serious he was about it. But he also understood that there were a lot of people who, and I'll say this, and some people are like, oh, well, they should have got their guns earlier and they should have, they waited till the last minute. I'm like this, you know what? Rights don't work that way. If a person, just because a person waits till the last minute to decide to exercise their right doesn't mean they lose that right. That's just not the way rights work. And so I think so. It's important for a lot of folks to make sure that right is available for folks to be able to exercise it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've spoken with a number of FFLs since this started, and I was at was Hudson's Outfitters up in Pennsylvania, near my mother's horse farm, and they were doing the same thing several weeks ago when this first became a real issue near Philadelphia, and they were only allowing 10 people in the store at once, and they had everyone waiting inside or outside in the line, and people were 6 feet apart during that process. And so I think people are taking it very seriously. I also spoke with Brandon Wexler, who owns a firearms shop in Florida where you are, and he was the same way. They're taking the social distancing very seriously, while trying to accommodate people, especially new buyers who are concerned for their safety. And in fact, they were at one point told to shut down by the city, the code enforcement there, and ended up getting the National Shooting Sports Foundation involved to push back against the city on that front, and won. And he was telling people, I will make sure that if you bought a firearm and you need a firearm right now, you'll be able to get it. Whatever the situation is, that he wasn't going to sort of abandon these people in a time where they felt unsafe and wanted to be able to get a firearm. And so I think you've seen that from a lot of FFLs across the country. It was interesting. Like Brandon, he was, talking about it as less of a business and more of a social duty to these people to help them be able to defend themselves. And I think that's the way that a lot of FFLs look at that and look at their jobs right now. And so that's why a lot of them have been very opposed to these shutdowns, because most of these gun businesses, your average gun store, especially if they're offering training as part of their business, selling the guns is generally not a high margin part of their business.
Right.
And so it's not necessarily that they're making a lot of money by selling these guns. And I know Brandon Wexler specifically wasn't raising his prices because of demand or anything like that. So, and I think that's been true at a lot of places across the country, but they're not necessarily staying open to try and keep their profit centers going. He had shut down his training side, which makes much more money, but he was keeping the dealer side going because he felt it was an important duty
right.
to people who wanted to be able to protect themselves.
Well, now, and that takes us actually to what you talked about as the first point was storyline, which was just the record number of firearms sales. I've heard anecdotally of people who were anti-gun all of a sudden showing up at the gun, protesting, some even in cases, even protesters showing up at gun stores to purchase firearms for self-defense. Have you heard a lot of those stories? Is what I'm hearing anecdotally, does that seem to be kind of bearing out across the country?
Yeah, I think I'm hearing a lot of the same things. And the industry itself, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the trade group, has said that as well, that they've seen a large increase in first-time buyers during this crisis, which is probably not necessarily the most surprising thing, but it does point to potentially significant changes in our politics moving forward. After this is all over, obviously that'll probably be a while. Maybe not everyone's top concern how the politics of this all work out, but it is something that probably will have an effect once we're through all this, because I think the tendency is once you own a firearm, you're a lot more familiar with the realities of that, and how that works out in the gun control versus gun rights debate.
I would think it would be ripe for an opportunity once this is all done to maybe institute or propose legislation for a tax. I don't know about tax credit, but maybe a tax deduction for firearms training. maybe a public information campaign promoting firearms training. I'm not a fan of mandating firearms training because what we've seen so far is whenever you mandate it, people basically take the bare minimum. But when you encourage it and when you promote it, people generally tend to take more than the bare minimum of when it comes to training with firearms. And I'm thinking with the record number of firearms that have been sold, that'd be a good thing to promote.
I mean, yeah, right. How that works out politically, we'll have to see. But obviously, when you have a new person come into the firearms community and they're owning a gun for the first time, especially in an environment where training is much harder to get at this point because of the realities of social distancing, it is important to try and do everything you can to encourage them to learn more about how to handle their firearms, to follow the four safety rules. Always keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to fire. Always treat every gun as though it's loaded. Don't assume a gun is unloaded. Always keep the barrel pointed in a safe direction, so not anything you don't want to shoot, essentially. And then always be aware of your target and what lies beyond it. So, if people can learn those four things, they should be a base level of gun ownership, of being able to safely handle a firearm. But there's obviously plenty more involved beyond those four rules. Those four rules can keep you safe and people around you safe, but learning how to properly handle your firearm, how it functions, how to clean it, how to understand how to carry it if that's something that someone wants to do, because that's another thing that has obviously seen a big surge is in concealed carry permit applications across the country.
Well, and understanding use of force, whether it's in your home, use of force law, when it refers to whether it's in your home or whether you're concealed carrying, it's important to know what your rights and your responsibilities are as a gun owner.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that the gun community is going to have to focus on, right? I mean, we've seen a number of organizations trying to help people understand their new responsibilities as a gun owner now that they've joined the community, right? Trying to offer online training, and there is online training out there. If you can't get to in-person training, that's better than nothing, for sure. So, any new gun owners, if you can, or if you know any new gun owners, you can point them in that direction at the very least, or you can show them, maybe one-on-one in a safe situation how to handle their firearms. If you're an experienced firearms owner, and you have a friend who's a new firearms owner, that's something that I think people should do and should be willing to do at this time.
Well, no, you're right. I think number one, some training is better than no training, even if it's online. A more experienced trainer is better than a less experienced trainer.
Yep.
So if you can get someone and go and get training, and by the way, more training is better than less training.
Right. And
all of that's vital information. Yeah.
Yeah. I had friends borrow a shotgun from me because they wanted to have something to protect their home, in an uncertain time. And, it was by the point that they were looking to get a gun, everything was pretty much sold out. So I told them, you can borrow one of my shotguns for the time being, until this stock comes back in and you can get your own. And I went and delivered the gun, and I showed them how to safely handle it at the same time, so that at least they have a base knowledge. It's a home defense shotgun. They're not going to go shooting for any other reason. So hopefully they will never need it. But at least I was able to give them some basic level of understanding of how the gun works, how to be safe with it. They had shot before, so they weren't complete amateurs. But it was something where that's something I think a lot of people who are experienced gun owners are going to have to take the responsibility to do for their new gun owning friends, if we want everyone to be as safe as possible, which is obviously should be our paramount goal in this.
Right. Now, let me ask you, what have you heard, or have you heard anything from some of our favorite foes on the Second Amendment, the Bloombergs, the Moms Demand Actions, Everytown's. Have you heard anything from them during all of this stuff that's been going on with COVID-19?
Yeah, certainly for a while, it was the gun rights people were pushing most of the message forward, and we're having a lot of success, frankly, in reversing the shutdown orders in places like Pennsylvania and Delaware, New Jersey, California, and North Carolina. And they're still having that success. But you have seen in recent days the gun control groups push back against that. And their position is that gun stores are not essential and ought to be shut down as part of these efforts, at least temporarily. And so you've seen a more organized effort to push back on the idea that gun stores are essential and should be allowed to stay open, at least on a limited basis. And they've also talked a lot about sort of the concerns of new gun owners potentially being, domestic abusers, and the dangers of domestic abusers in a shutdown order having firearms in their home. Potentially a legitimate concern there, but they seem to. That's
in many of their eyes, simply wanting to own a gun makes you a potential domestic abuser. It's sad that they think that way, but some of them do.
Sure. I think certainly obviously in a domestic abuse situation, you don't want a domestic abuser to have a firearm. That's why we make it illegal for those people who've committed even misdemeanor domestic abuse convictions to own firearms. So, there's certainly a legitimate concern there. I just think that obviously they're promoting sort of the certainly their talking points are about the worst case scenarios of new gun owners.
Yeah.
And there's sort of not an understanding, I think, they aren't willing to admit why people would want to buy firearms in a time like this. You see a lot of, from the less sophisticated gun control advocates, you'll see a lot of talk about, what are people going to do? They're going to shoot the virus. And it's like,
well, it's funny. One of the interesting things is when you talk about domestic violence, Carrie Sloan out of Washington State talks a lot about this. A lot of times these restrictions that you place, it doesn't just place a restriction on the domestic abuser, but the abused. So if the abused wants to own a firearm or have a firearm at their disposal to be able to protect them from that abuser, there are a lot of restrictions that are being placed on them. If you place these restrictions, if you put these restrictions out there.
Yeah. I mean, there's just clearly a huge divide between what gun control groups are concerned about in regards to firearms and the virus, and what gun rights groups are concerned about. Obviously, the gun control people are pushing, the message of, guns in your home make you less safe, and then because of domestic violence or accidental shootings or whatever, they have a list of things that they bring up in that regard. And then obviously on the gun rights side, you have the argument that, firearms are your right for self-defense, among other things. But for the current moment, people want to buy guns so that they can protect themselves if they have to. I mean, police forces are already experiencing high levels of contamination with the virus. There's a lot of police in New York and New Jersey who have tested positive for the virus, and that's going to limit their ability as a police force to respond to all sorts of different crimes. And that's something that I think is a legitimate concern for people, obviously. Yeah. And that's where the gun rights groups are focused, that people have a right to own firearms for their own self-protection. They have a very heightened need for it at this particular moment and in the coming weeks. And so they should be allowed to have access to purchasing these self-defense weapons. And that's what the focus is on the gun rights side. So you see a huge difference in what the focus has been between the two sides.
Hey, where can folks find your work and follow some of the stories that you're writing on Second Amendment issues?
Yeah, they could find me on the Free Beacon. That's freebeacon.com. Or you can find me on Twitter at Stephen Gutowski.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you. Really appreciate all of the work that you do. As I said, as I said in my introduction, there aren't a lot of publications that actually have are broad-based publications that have committed staff that write on our issue, that are knowledgeable about our issue. So I really appreciate the work that you do.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. Also, it's Wex Gunworks was the gun store I was talking about down in Delray, Florida. So if people have a chance, they can go and see what's up there with Brandon. So
excellent, sir. Thank you so very much. You take care. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Gutowski, Washington Free Beacon. Well, that'll be it for this edition of the Gunshine State. We very much appreciate you folks tuning in. We also appreciate you liking and sharing the program, telling your friends about Florida Carry, Florida's premier Second Amendment civil rights advocacy group. You guys take care. We'll talk to you again real soon.